Much of whether a coup or mutiny will be successful depends on the element of surprise. They are not situations where two large militaries face off on opposite sides of the battlefield, where surprise is helpful but will not save you when you are vastly outnumbered. Instead, coups and mutinies are ticking time bombs. They can be won or lost in a matter of hours. Catch the leader off guard, arrest him, take control of a few pressure points in the capital, and checkmate, you can now declare yourself the king. At that point, it is up to everyone else to unseat you, and that is a risky decision for any of your potential opponents to make. So they may just fall in line. It could still take a few weeks for the situation to stabilize, but the hard part is over. With that in mind, we now have a better idea of why the Wagner opera failed. The new details come from reports in the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. If true, emphasis on if, a very fun point that we will come back to later, the problem was surprise, or lack thereof. It appears that Russian intelligence uncovered Yevegeny Prigozhin's plot to usurp power from the Ministry of Defense. This forced Wagner to accelerate its plans. However, Russia foiled the initial step, and although Wagner captured Rostov-on-Don with surprising ease, the group lacked a contingency plan. This led to the unscripted scramble to Moscow and the mutiny's end. But the details are more complicated. Today, we are going to cover the basic background behind the intelligence reports, what the intelligence reports claim, how it makes sense of the observed truce, how it strangely makes Russia appear weaker than it did before, and a fun theory about the authenticity of the report. But we begin with the publicly known information of how we got here. The origins of today's drama trace back to February 2014, a time when Kyiv was in crisis. Putin began maneuvering what would later be called Little Green Men into Crimea to prepare for the peninsula's annexation. Some of those green guys were actually Wagner musicians. After President Viktor Yanukovych fled to Russia, coincidentally Rostov-on-Don, Putin pulled the trigger. The annexation went off with barely a hitch. With the mission accomplished, Wagner moved to the Donbass. The main target? Luhansk Oblast. The goal? Foment a separatist movement. Major operations there terminated in 2015. A handful of Wagner faithful stayed behind, but the bulk headed to Africa or the Syrian civil war. Nevertheless, 7 years later, they would be back at it as Putin prepared for the invasion. Some may have taken part in assassination plots to remove Zelensky from power, but we all know how those fizzled, and how Zelensky celebrated with a wardrobe change. However, most of Wagner's contributions came along the Eastern Front. This is critical because the Western Front proved to be a disaster. Meanwhile, the Southern Front was a mixed bag for Russia. But as the phases of the war shifted, Wagner would have the opportunity to demonstrate its utility to the Kremlin. The Battle of Bakhmut began in August, pairing Wagner forces with regular Russian troops in urban combat against Ukraine. 1 month later, and slightly north of Wagner's position in Bakhmut, Ukraine began making massive gains in its September counteroffensive. During all this, there were long-running rumors of who controlled Wagner, but it was at this point when Prigozhin stepped out of the shadows and revealed himself to be the puppet master of Wagner all along. As he saw things, outside of the initial Eastern thrust, Russian strategy had been abysmal. He was on a mission now to prove Wagner's superiority. As Russia's position grew worse with the loss of Kherson, Wagner kept pecking away. In January 2023, Prigozhin's forces took Soledar, a salt mine community just north of Bakhmut. It was the first notable gain for Russia in what seemed like forever, but Wagner was claiming the victory for itself. Around this time, it is plausible that Prigozhin realized that he had an opportunity to advance his political career. The next 4 months again saw Russia drawing blanks, except for slow progress in Wagner's Bakhmut campaign. By May, victory in Bakhmut appeared imminent. However, this is when the ammo wars began. Prigozhin released a series of social media tirades, accusing the Russian Ministry of Defense of withholding the vital supplies that Wagner needed to complete the job. If that did not change, then Wagner would withdraw from Bakhmut, leaving the Russian regulars to fend for themselves. All of the progress from the last 6 months would be put in, well, jeopardy. There are 4 non-mutually exclusive interpretations of what happened here. First, Prigozhin's assessment is correct. After all, it would not be the first time that the MOD made significant errors during the war. Second, the MOD faced a trade-off. Ukraine's counterattack was on the way, and rationing decisions may have gone against Wagner. Third, Prigozhin's public pivot arose suspicions that he had plans to go rogue. Finally, Wagner was not actually bullet-starved. Rather, Prigozhin was stockpiling ammunition for the opera he was about to conduct. Regardless, Wagner and Moscow got back on the same page, at least temporarily. Bakhmut subsequently fell, further bolstering the Wagner narrative. However, then the MOD apparently felt that preemptive action was necessary. In June, it drafted orders for all mercenary groups to sign MOD contracts. This would effectively mean the end of Wagner, so Prigozhin passed. By June 10th, if he had not made up his mind already, Prigozhin decided to make a play. Now we can get into the details of the new intelligence reports. The source is an American intelligence official. Keep that in mind as we get deeper into the analysis. The main villains in Prigozhin's eyes were Minister of Defense Sergei Shoigu and Chief of Staff Valery Gerasimov, whom Prigozhin saw as weak bureaucrats whose incompetence and corruption had turned the invasion into a disaster. But an opportunity arose nearby. Rostov-on-Don was the main hub of the war effort, and through the normal course of business, both Shoigu and Gerasimov were planning to visit there at the end of June. The city conveniently borders Donetsk, where Wagner troops were resting following their victory in Bakhmut. Thus, Wagner could blitz to Rostov-on-Don and capture the pair. What would happen next is ambiguous. Perhaps throw them in a cell and then hold them prisoner? Try them in a mock military tribunal? Force action from Putin to dismiss them? Regardless of the mechanism, this was a low-level coup times 2, or more precisely, a mutiny. Either way, surprise was key. Successfully capturing the pair would shift the status quo outcome in favor of Prigozhin. That part might be especially important in trying to remove Shoigu, who was Putin's longtime vacation pal. However, the FSB was there to rain on Prigozhin's parade. 2 days before the Wagner plot was to begin, Russia's main security agency learned of it. The silver lining for Prigozhin was that he had been tipped off that the FSB knew. How the knowledge disseminated either way is unclear. Much of the speculation falls on Sergei Surovikin, commander-in-chief of Russia's aerospace forces, and briefly the commander of the overall invasion, as Russian forces withdrew from Kherson in November of 2022. It is possible that Prigozhin alerted Surovikin to the plot, and then Surovikin informed the FSB. After all, his air force seemed like the only entity interested in slowing down the Moscow convoy, with the casualties to underscore that point. However, Surovikin and Prigozhin may be friendly with one another, and a yet more recent report indicates that Surovikin was secretly a member of Wagner. Perhaps the FSB, not knowing the connection, informed Surovikin about the plot, and then Surovikin forwarded the message to Prigozhin. If so, why the Air Force then fired on Wagner is unclear. Regardless, the plot was spoiled, and Prigozhin knew that he had been found out. He now faced a dilemma on what to do. But rather than stay the course or just give up, Wagner accelerated the plot. On June 23rd, Prigozhin released a video that essentially outlined his public case against the Ministry of Defense. Later that day, he released a second video accusing the MOD of bombing his troops. Real, imagined, or false flag, this became Prigozhin's call to arms. Wagner sprinted to Rostov-on-Don. The city fell without a fight early the next morning. But Shoigu and Gerasimov? Well, they vanished into thin air. Perhaps the FSB let them in on the secret. Perhaps Wagner's accelerated timeline was just too rushed, leaving the pair in a position where Prigozhin could not imprison them. Or perhaps they just got lucky. Whatever the case, the climax of Wagner's opera had no audience, apparently without a contingency plan, and perhaps surprised at how easy they took Rostov-on-Don. Wagner troops sped off toward the capital. But somewhere past the halfway point, Prigozhin realized that Moscow was a different beast. With Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko's exile offer in hand, he went safe and chose the exit strategy. Those are the reports. Let's cut through them now and look for the deeper implications. Presumably, by the time the convoy had departed, Putin knew that Prigozhin held a relatively weak hand outside of Rostov-on-Don. However, the optics of Wagner making it all the way to Moscow would have been terrible, even if the mutineers were near certain to lose. Perhaps under ordinary times, he would have preferred rolling the dice to giving Prigozhin a path to exile. But we do not live in ordinary times. Meanwhile, Prigozhin was in too deep to walk away without some assurances, so we got the deal that we observed, and maybe more if Shoigu or Gerasimov were to suddenly lose office. Despite Putin's apparent Moscow fortress, the rest of the opera must be very concerning to him regarding the stability of his regime. If the FSB had even a small amount of advanced knowledge of the plot, it seems that Prigozhin should not have gotten as far as he did. Did the FSB simply not relay the information to the MOD, essentially giving Prigozhin a free pass? If so, then Putin has a major problem with the main security service within his government. At least during Soviet times, losing the support of the KGB was an express ticket to retirement. But it may be yet worse if the FSB did forewarn Putin. That would tell us that the Ministry of Defense is so unpopular that it could not hold a logistics hub despite knowing what was about to happen. To make matters worse, the convoy drove deep into the country, though if this was indeed inaudible from Prigozhin, they could be forgiven because the FSB could not warn them of that aspect of the plot. Either way, Putin is going to have to clean house. There is some evidence that this is already underway, with Sergei Surovikin missing in action, suggesting that the Kremlin finds his role in this suspicious. Finally, there is always the possibility that this leak came from an American intelligence official, but that the report itself is fictional. Imagine for a second that it is an entirely fabricated CIA fantasy. In truth, the FSB did not know about the plot, military intelligence did not know either, no one. If you want to stir the pot and cause a bunch of unnecessary purging, this would be a good way to do that. Welcome to the wonderful world of counterintelligence. Still, it is worth noting that there are separate reports of concurrent intelligence estimates within the US intel community that Prigozhin was going to try something, and further kept it a secret to US allies, much to their annoyance. If it leaked to the United States, then there is a greater chance that someone within the Russian intelligence community also knew. Nevertheless, the possibility of a false report is a neat idea. And if the lines on maps guy did his job today, it also plausibly explains the observable features of what occurred, which is the mark of a good deception operation. Speaking of neat ideas, why not check out my book on the causes of the invasion? See the video description for more information about that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care. As much fun as hashtag Where's Putin and hashtag Where's Zelensky have been, there are 3 actual people missing. Thus, until Gerasimov and Surovikin officially return to the job, or are arrested or otherwise, they will be the ones hiding. Kind of like how Gerasimov was touring the American Civil War last time. Likewise, until there is further confirmation of Prigozhin's status in Belarus, he is also in the mix. Putin and Zelensky will be taking a break, but I doubt we have seen the last of them. And, you know what? Until then, I will probably be keeping Putin with binoculars in the regular mix of standard images, like I did today, just because it's a great photo. He just won't be hiding in the traditional sense. So, in summary, it's hashtag Where's Gerasimov, hashtag Where's Surovikin, note the 2 S's there, and hashtag Where's Prigozhin. Good luck.